The lead was in the crystal, the asbestos was overhead. The carcinogens were saturated into the sofa cushions. Every evening your family gathered in that room and called it home. Here are 30 things from a 1980s living room that Americans who grew up during this era will never see the same way again. Before flat screens reduced television to a rectangle on the wall, the console television dominated the American living room, a piece of furniture built into a wooden cabinet and weighing upward of 200 pounds. Families gathered around sets built around a cathode ray tube, a device that accelerated electrons at high voltage. The engineering required produced something manufacturers never mentioned: radiation. In the 1960s, General Electric sold color sets that emitted radiation above federal thresholds and recalled more than 90,000 units in 1967. Congress responded with the Radiation Control for Health and Safety Act of 1968. By the 1980s, the sets met that standard, but the plastic casing now contained polybrominated diphenyl ethers, known as PBDES, flame retardants, that shed continuously into the room air and dust. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found measurable polybrominated diphenyl ether levels in virtually every American tested. No warning came with the set. The paneling gave the room a cabin warmth. Vertical strips of dark veneer running floor to ceiling, installed by homeowners across the decade without a contractor in sight. Beneath that surface was particle board bonded with urea formaldehyde resin, a glue that did not stay bound. Formaldehyde off-gases continuously from composite wood products, and the Environmental Protection Agency identified urea formaldehyde particle board as the largest single source of indoor formaldehyde emissions in American homes. In warm, humid conditions, the rate increased. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies formaldehyde as a Group 1 human carcinogen. The paneling carried no warning label and no chemical disclosure of any kind. Your parents sealed the house against the winter cold, and the walls did the rest. Shag carpet was the decade's loudest living room statement: thick pile in harvest gold, burnt sienna, or avocado green installed wall to wall. It was also a chemical sponge. New carpet throughout the 1980s was bonded to its backing with styrene butadiene latex and treated with coatings that off-gassed volatile organic compounds, including 4-phenylcyclohexene, the sharp chemical smell families took as proof the carpet was fresh. Investigators identified new carpet as a primary contributor. In 1987, workers at the newly carpeted Environmental Protection Agency headquarters in Washington, D.C. filed hundreds of illness complaints, including headaches, burning eyes, and respiratory irritation. The irony that Environmental Protection Agency employees documented a hazard their own agency had not regulated was recorded internally and quietly filed away. The carpet stayed. In living rooms across America, families kept walking barefoot through fibers releasing the same compounds. If you walked into a suburban American living room in the 1980s, the ashtray sat on the end table like a permanent fixture, ceramic and decorative, used every evening during the news and family movie night. The 1986 Surgeon General's report made explicit what tobacco companies had suppressed for decades. There is no safe level of exposure to secondhand smoke. For children in smoking households, cumulative exposure produced measurable increases in respiratory illness, middle ear infections, and adult lung disease. Particulate matter from a burning cigarette in an enclosed room settles into upholstery and carpet and then emits gases for hours. Studies found children in smoking households had cotinine levels, a biomarker of nicotine absorption equivalent to actively smoking more than a cigarette per day. The ashtray sat out for company. It was the center of the room. But the smoke drifting across that room wasn't the only thing your family consumed without knowing what was in it. The Waterford decanter on the sideboard, the wedding gift, the heirloom, was leaching lead into whatever it held. Crystal glassware qualifies for that label at a minimum of 24% lead oxide content by weight, and that lead does not stay inert in contact with alcoholic or acidic liquids. A study in The Lancet in 1991 found port wine stored in a lead crystal decanter, accumulating lead at 3,518 micrograms per liter. After 4 months, more than 70 times the FDA permitted level. Spirits stored long-term reached above 21,000 micrograms per liter. 50% of all leeching occurred in the first minute of contact. The decanter was never banned. Waterford sold lead crystal through the decade with no warning and no storage guidance. It was marketed as the finest glassware in the world.
Between 1991 and 2002, the Consumer Product Safety Commission documented 130 strangulation deaths of young children caused by the looped pull cords on residential window blinds. The tracking only began in 1991. The design that produced those deaths had been the industry standard since the 1960s, a single continuous loop accessible at child height, often near furniture children climbed. Roughly 85 million window blind units were sold annually in the United States throughout the decade. Every price point, every retailer, every living room. The Window Covering Safety Council did not reach a voluntary agreement to eliminate looped cords on new blinds until 1995. The blinds already installed were not recalled. Free repair kits were made available by phone. Most families never called. The bumpy spray texture on the living room ceiling, called popcorn, acoustic tile, or cottage cheese depending on your region, was banned from new manufacture in 1977 when the Environmental Protection Agency prohibited asbestos in textured paints. That ban covered new production, not existing inventory. Contractors applied asbestos-containing popcorn texture to residential ceilings as late as 1980, working through warehouse supplies after the cutoff. Undisturbed, the material posed little risk. Ceilings are not undisturbed. They are painted over, scraped, and cracked as houses settle. A popcorn ceiling with 1 to 10% asbestos content, the standard documented range, releases chrysotile fibers when disturbed. Those fibers accumulate in lung tissue. Mesothelioma symptoms appear 20 to 50 years after exposure. The families who scraped their own ceilings in the 1980s without testing were the ones receiving diagnoses in the 2000s. In 1975, California enacted Technical Bulletin 117, requiring furniture foam to resist a small open flame for 12 seconds. Chemical manufacturers chose to meet that standard by saturating polyurethane foam with polybrominated diphenyl ethers, known by the initials PBDE. Because no manufacturer made separate product lines for California and for other states, the PBDE sofa became the universal American sofa. The flame retardants were not chemically bonded to the foam. They migrated into the air and settled into household dust, where people inhaled them daily, especially toddlers, pressing their faces into cushions. Penta-BDE, the dominant compound used through 2005, was linked to cancer, hormone disruption, and reduced IQ in children. The CDC found measurable levels of PBDE in virtually all Americans tested. The Consumer Product Safety Commission did not ban these flame retardants from furniture until 2017, 42 years after California caused the problem. Plug-in air fresheners were everywhere in the 1980s living room, small electric devices warming scented oil and releasing fragrance continuously into the air. They were marketed as the clean smell of a fresh home. What they actually released included formaldehyde, benzene, naphthalene, and 1,4-dichlorobenzene, a chlorinated solvent detected in off-the-shelf air fresheners by independent researchers in subsequent testing. 1,4-dichlorobenzene, the compound that gives mothballs their sharp chemical smell, was found at concentrations up to 5 times higher in households using plug-in fresheners regularly. The EPA classifies it as a possible human carcinogen under the Federal Hazardous Substances Act. During that decade, manufacturers were not required to disclose fragrance formula contents.
They were proprietary and legally shielded from disclosure. The label said, "fresh linen." No federal disclosure requirement for air freshener chemical contents existed at any point during the 1980s. The wood-burning fireplace was the heart of the 1980s living room. Crackling pine, orange glow, the family gathered around a heat source that felt ancient and entirely safe. What was also filling the room when the damper was closed or the chimney poorly drafted was fine particulate matter with diameters below 2.5 micrometers, too small for the lungs' filtering system, depositing directly in the alveoli. Wood smoke contains benzene, formaldehyde, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and carbon monoxide. The EPA did not establish air quality standards for residential fine particulate matter until 1997. Through the entire decade, no federal standard governed how much particulate a wood-burning fireplace could release into the interior air of a home. In several regions, state agencies identified residential wood burning as the largest single indoor source of fine particulate exposure for regular users. The fireplace was never regulated indoors. It still is not. And if the fireplace was a heat source your family understood to be hot, the halogen torchiere floor lamp was one that looked completely harmless. A slender pole, 6 feet tall, flaring into a polished bowl aimed at the ceiling, sold as modern design at Kmart and Costco for $20. The 300-watt halogen bulb inside reached 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no guard between that element and any fabric that drifted into range, including curtains, throws, and loose paper. In 1996, the Consumer Product Safety Commission estimated these lamps had caused at least 250 fires and 12 deaths. The industry had lobbied against mandatory guarding requirements for years. The CPSC brokered a recall of over 40 million lamps produced before 1997, the largest lamp recall in agency history. Models without a guard dominated the market throughout the decade. In December of 1984, a construction engineer named Stanley Watrous walked into the Limerick nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania and triggered its radiation detectors. The plant had no nuclear fuel on site. Officials traced the contamination to Watrous himself, to his home in Colebrookdale Township, where they measured indoor radon at 2,700 picocuries per liter. The EPA action threshold is 4 picocuries per liter. The Watrous home held nearly 700 times the safe limit, with 2 young children living inside it, the highest radon concentration ever documented in an American residence. Radon is a colorless, odorless, radioactive gas produced by uranium decay in soil and rock. It enters through foundation cracks and accumulates in living spaces. It is the leading cause of lung cancer in non-smokers in the United States. The Watrous case forced the EPA to create its indoor radon program in 1988. Before that, virtually no American homeowners tested for the gas accumulating in their living rooms and bedrooms. The entertainment center was the 1980s living room's monument to itself, a floor-to-ceiling wall unit in pressed wood and faux oak veneer holding the television, the VCR, cassette decks, and every framed photograph the family owned. It was also, by surface area, the single largest source of formaldehyde off-gassing in most American homes. Pressed wood products, particle board shelving, medium-density fiberboard, laminated panels are manufactured with urea formaldehyde adhesives that release the compound continuously faster in heat and humidity. The EPA investigated formaldehyde in pressed wood products throughout the decade and classified it a probable human carcinogen in 1987. Congress did not establish federal limits on formaldehyde emissions from composite wood products until the Formaldehyde Standards for Composite Wood Products Act of 2010, more than 2 decades after the EPA's own classification. Mothballs were a staple of the 1980s American home, small white spheres tucked into closets and the storage ottoman in the living room corner. Their sharp chemical smell was accepted as the scent of protection against moths. The active compound was naphthalene, a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon derived from coal tar. Naphthalene vapor accumulates in enclosed spaces and at sufficient concentrations causes headaches, nausea, and respiratory irritation. In children with a specific enzyme deficiency, exposure can trigger hemolytic anemia, a condition in which red blood cells are destroyed faster than the body can replace them. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classified naphthalene a Group 2B possible human carcinogen in 2002. In households where mothballs were stored in living room furniture, the room where your family spent every evening, naphthalene vapor was present in the breathing air year-round. No warning label addressed indoor air concentration. But if the chemicals in your living room storage were a slow accumulation, an electric blanket folded over the back of the sofa was a more direct proposition. Early electric blankets sold through the 1980s were controlled by a simple dial with no automatic shutoff, with a heating element woven through the fabric and connected to household current. There was no mechanism to prevent the blanket from heating indefinitely if it was left turned up. The Consumer Product Safety Commission received more than 86 complaints about the Built Safe brand alone. Blankets overheated, charred, burned, or melted after the thermostat failed. That brand required recalls in both 2004 and 2008. Through the 1980s, electric blankets were sold without automatic shutoff requirements and without mandatory high-temperature cutoffs. Families folded them over the back of the sofa. Some left them plugged in continuously. The fire risk was not on the label. The Mercury thermometer on the mantel was a fixture in the 1980s living room, a thin glass tube kept within reach for every sick child and uncertain forehead. Mercury's toxicity was not a secret. The element had been recognized as a neurotoxin since the 19th century, and its effects, tremors, cognitive impairment, sensory nerve damage, were documented in occupational medicine for decades before the first household thermometer was manufactured. What changed was the regulatory standard. The EPA and several states began restricting mercury thermometer sales in the late 1990s, with the FDA completing a phase-out of mercury fever thermometers in 2001. Through the entire 1980s decade, a glass tube of liquid mercury was standard household equipment, kept on mantels and in medicine cabinets, and when it broke, as glass tubes do, the silvery beads scattered across carpet, vaporizing slowly at room temperature into the air the family breathed. The horizontal Venetian blind, aluminum slats threaded with cord and adjusted by a twist rod, was standard in the 1980s living room window. In homes built before 1978, they were frequently coated in lead paint applied at original installation. Lead paint on metal surfaces abrades rather than chips. Every time the slats were adjusted, the painted aluminum rubbed against the cord and against each other, generating fine lead-containing dust that settled on the windowsill, the carpet below, and on the hands of anyone who touched the rod. Children handle window blinds constantly, adjusting them for light, playing with the cord, and running fingers along the slats. The federal ban on residential lead paint in 1978 did not require removal of existing painted surfaces already installed in homes. The blinds were never recalled. The dust they generated was never measured by any mandatory testing program. The smoking stand was furniture designed entirely around the permanence of indoor tobacco use. A purpose-built side table with a built-in ashtray, a holder for cigarettes, and sometimes a small drawer for matches. It stood beside the armchair, a dedicated infrastructure for smoking in the family living room that no one questioned placing there. Smoking stands were available throughout the decade at department stores and home furnishing catalogs. Some models included a small lighter fueled by butane built into the base. The existence of these pieces tells you everything about the cultural baseline. Not only was smoking indoors accepted, it was worth designing furniture around. The 1986 Surgeon General's report on secondhand smoke did not produce an immediate cultural shift. The smoking stands stayed in the stores for years after. Some are still in use today. In 1984, the World Health Organization estimated that up to 30% of new or renovated buildings globally were generating occupant illness complaints consistent with a cluster of symptoms the organization named sick building syndrome, headaches, eye and throat irritation, fatigue, no identified cause. The 1980s built the problem. Energy regulations from the 1970s produced a generation of tightly sealed, heavily insulated residential construction designed to minimize heat loss. What they also minimized was air exchange. In a well-sealed 1980s home, formaldehyde from paneling, benzene from carpet adhesive and air fresheners, radon from the foundation, and off-gassing from synthetic textiles accumulated together with nowhere to go. The EPA launched an indoor air quality program in 1987. It was advisory. No mandatory residential ventilation standard for new home construction existed at the federal level during the decade. The house was sealed tight. Everything inside it stayed. Before the tightly sealed home became a chemical chamber, someone had to furnish it, and the glass-top coffee table was the decade's most stylish living room addition. Smoked or clear glass on chrome legs, sold at furniture stores nationwide as a sleek, modern centerpiece. The glass in most of these tables was annealed, standard flat glass, the same material used in window panes, not tempered safety glass. Annealed glass does not break into small, relatively harmless cubes when it fractures. It shatters into large, irregular shards with razor edges. The Consumer Product Safety Commission had been advocating for mandatory tempered glass in furniture since the 1970s. No mandatory federal standard required tempered glass in residential furniture through the decade. The tables were sold without disclosure of glass type, without safety labels, and without any industry-wide requirement to use safety glass. Today, it is the standard. Back then, it was optional, and most manufacturers chose the cheaper material. In older homes, renovated and updated over the decades, living room walls often shared their interior space, with basement and utility pipes wrapped in asbestos lagging, a fibrous insulation applied to hot water and steam pipes throughout American residential construction from the 1920s through the late 1970s. Where pipes ran through walls shared with living areas, as they did in millions of older split-level and ranch-style homes, deteriorating asbestos insulation released chrysotile and amosite fibers into the living space through gaps around pipe penetrations and outlet boxes. Johns Manville, the dominant asbestos insulation manufacturer, knew of the health risks as early as the 1930s and suppressed internal safety studies for decades. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1982 under the weight of asbestos liability claims. The insulation it had sold remained in the walls of those homes, aging in place and slowly shedding fibers into the air of rooms where families watched television every night. The aerosol can of hairspray on the side table, Aquanet, White Rain, and Rave, was a 1980s living room fixture, the sharp chemical hiss filling the air for a moment before dissipating. Through the mid-70s, it used chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, as the propellant gases, the chemicals at the center of the ozone depletion crisis. Scientists Rowland and Molina documented the mechanism in 1974. The United States banned CFC propellants in aerosol consumer products in 1978. Hairspray manufacturers switched to hydrocarbon propellants, butane, propane, and isobutane. The new propellants did not destroy the ozone layer. They were, however, highly flammable, with flashpoints below room temperature. In a living room with candles, a gas fireplace pilot light, or a halogen lamp burning nearby, the brief cloud of hydrocarbon propellant from an aerosol can was a momentary ignition hazard. The instructions did not say so. The label said to avoid open flame. In practice, no one checked the room before they sprayed. In 1980, the average residential ionization smoke detector contained 3 microcuries of americium-241. Ionization detectors work by passing a small electrical current through a chamber where alpha particles from the americium source ionize the air. Smoke interrupts that current and triggers the alarm. The Pyrotronics Corporation manufactured commercial-grade units that held up to 80 microcuries of americium-241, 80 times the residential standard. Disposal instructions for expired detectors were not prominently disclosed, and large numbers went to landfill despite Nuclear Regulatory Commission requirements that spent units be returned to manufacturers. Americium-241 has a half-life of 432 years. If inhaled or ingested from a damaged source, it deposits in bone and liver tissue and remains for decades. Its biological retention half-life is approximately 50 years. The detector on your ceiling was, in normal operation, perfectly safe. The ones that were broken, discarded improperly, or crushed in a landfill were a different calculation. The Dieffenbachia was everywhere in the 1980s living room, a broadleaf tropical plant sold at every garden center, marketed as low-maintenance indoor greenery, and placed on side tables, in corners, and beside the entertainment center. Its common name was dumb cane. The name was not decorative. Every part of the Dieffenbachia contains needle-sharp calcium oxalate crystals packed into specialized cells. When a leaf is broken or chewed, those crystals embed in soft tissue, the tongue, gums, and throat, causing immediate burning pain and, in sufficient exposure, swelling severe enough to temporarily impair speech. In children and household pets, the reaction can be more severe. The plant was sold without a warning label, required no childproofing, and carried no caution about placement near toddlers or animals. It sat on the coffee table beside the lead crystal bowl and was considered, by every measure of 1980s domestic life, a wholesome piece of home decor. But the most decorative items in the 1980s living room were often the most dangerous, and the lead crystal highball glass set in the cabinet was leaching lead every time it was used. The same 24% lead oxide content that gave Waterford and Baccarat crystal its famous clarity also made it reactive to acidic and alcoholic liquids. A 1991 lawsuit in San Francisco named Waterford, alleging the company was selling lead crystal baby bottles made with the same lead-containing material as its adult barware. The case was reportedly settled. Waterford discontinued the baby bottles, but continued selling lead crystal adult glassware without a warning label. Research in The Lancet that year demonstrated wine eluted measurable lead from crystal within minutes. Your parents set the table with those glasses for every holiday dinner. When new carpet was installed in the 1980s, homes often had the carpet glued to a concrete slab or to a plywood subfloor. The adhesive used was typically a solvent-based compound containing toluene, benzene, and methylene chloride in concentrations high enough to fill a closed room with fumes you could smell from the doorway. These solvents dissipated over days to weeks, and in tightly sealed new construction, they lingered longer. Toluene affects the central nervous system at elevated concentrations, causing dizziness, headaches, and impaired coordination. Benzene is a carcinogen classified as Group 1 by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Methylene chloride metabolizes in the body to carbon monoxide. Families moved into freshly carpeted homes and spent the first weeks in rooms carrying the chemical signature of the adhesive curing beneath their feet. No federal disclosure requirement existed for solvent content in residential carpet adhesive. The installer left, the windows were closed, the smell faded before the chemicals did. The big screen projection television was the 1980s living room's ultimate status symbol, a cabinet the size of a small car housing 3 cathode ray tubes that projected onto a curved reflective screen. The whole assembly could weigh several hundred pounds and required professional delivery. It was also, when it failed, a significant electrocution hazard. Projection sets contained capacitors that stored charge exceeding 25,000 volts, and those capacitors could retain that charge after the set was unplugged, sometimes for hours. Repair technicians working on these sets without proper discharge procedures risked contact with electrical energy sufficient to stop a heart. Consumer manuals warned against user service without explaining why. These sets cost between $2,000 and $5,000 in 1985, the price of a used car, and owners who could not afford professional repair sometimes opened the cabinet themselves. Tension pole lamps were a 1980s living room staple, spring-loaded aluminum poles wedged between floor and ceiling, fitted with 2 or 3 adjustable fixtures, sold as flexible, no-installation lighting for under $30 at every discount retailer in America. The wiring running up that pole was typically a single lamp cord taped at intervals to the shaft, with no conduit protection and no strain relief at the points where it bent around the fixtures. Pole lamps manufactured throughout the decade were not subject to mandatory wiring standards specific to multi-socket floor lamp assemblies. The Underwriters Laboratory certification on many models covered the individual sockets, but not the assembled wiring configuration. In homes where lamps were used with bulbs exceeding the fixture's rated wattage, a common practice, the unprotected wiring overheated at contact points. The lamps were never recalled. They are not banned today. They were retired by fashion, not by regulation. The floor-to-ceiling mirror wall was the 1980s living room's most ambitious DIY project. Large glass panels were mounted to drywall with adhesive and clip hardware, and it was a decorating magazine staple that promised the illusion of doubled space. The adhesive most commonly used was a solvent-based contact cement containing methylene chloride, a solvent that metabolizes in the body to carbon monoxide at elevated exposure. In a closed room during installation, with a gallon of contact cement brush applied to multiple large surfaces, methylene chloride concentrations could reach levels associated with central nervous system effects. The CPSC documented deaths from methylene chloride exposure in consumer refinishing projects throughout the 1980s and proposed restricting the compound in 1987. That restriction was not finalized for paint strippers until 2019. For mirror adhesive, it was never addressed. The living room itself was the hazard. It was not any single item. Not the sofa alone, not the paneling alone, not the carpet, the blinds, or the ceiling, but the room as a system. All of it operating simultaneously in a tightly sealed structure your family occupied for 4 to 6 hours every evening. The formaldehyde from the paneling mixed with off-gassing carpet adhesive, plug-in air freshener vapors, and naphthalene from the storage ottoman. The PBDE flame retardants from the sofa shed into carpet dust where children played. Radon rose through the floor. Asbestos held steady in the walls as long as nothing disturbed it. None of these exposures, in isolation, constituted a crisis by the standards of the decade. Together, in an unventilated room over a childhood, they constituted something regulators did not yet have a name for. The EPA would spend the following 2 decades developing the vocabulary. Your family spent those years in the room. They sold a generation the idea that the living room was the safest place in the house. Like this video if that made you angry.